Hello everybody, I am Dr.V.S.Shakila, Assistant Professor of English, the Standard Fireworks Rajaratnam College for Women, Sivagasi. Let's discuss the poem Measurements today. Measurements is a poem which highlights how we often try to measure everything in life. However, it shows that something like emotions and deeper experiences cannot be measured or quantified. First, let's get to know the author. Measurements is a poem written by an Assamese poet, Nabaganda Barua. He belongs to the new generation of poets in Assamese literature. He writes in the modernist tradition of Hopkins, where Hopkins uses sprung rhythm and Nabaganda Barua also uses sprung rhythm in his poems. He also follows W.P. Yeats, who writes the conflicts between the romantic and the modern, and also T.S. Eliot, who uses material and spiritual hollowness in all his. Nabaganda Barua has received the Sahitya Academy Award for Assamese literature in 1975. The poem has a good deal of influence of T.S. Eliot. This poem reminds the beginning of prufrock and depicts the purposelessness, hollowness and faithlessness of modern existence. It bears the influence of the European decadent culture, which reveals the inner crisis of the human soul through doubts, apprehensions, boredom and frustration. Nabaganda Barua's poems expresses a sense of estrangement from one's own self. Barua is known for the delineation of culture, modernity, human values, insensitivity of the modern people through his poetry. In his poems, he brings things entailed with social, emotional and philosophical ideas. He also brings in the concurrent themes, which are a juxtaposition between the images of love and death, of hope and anxiety. His poems also expresses a kind of guilt in the author for being ungrateful to the Mother Earth for all her kindness. It leads to the emergence of the conflict between the beauty of the countryside and rapidly modernizing the growth of cities. Barua is the one who brought modernity in Assamese poetry by depicting a modern society in which he was brought up and schooled. He lived that modern society himself. He depicts sufferings and injustice of his own society. Through his works, he marks a transition from the romantic Assamese poetry, which depicts nature and the beauty of the countryside with some philosophical meanings, to the modernist tradition that was grounded in the current reality of that time. For example, he presents the city of Calcutta in its splendor and squalor against the backdrop of wars, revolutions, partition, hope, suffering, dreams and death of dreams. He was the pioneer among those who tried to take Assamese poetry far away from the influence of Bangla poetry, especially of Rabindranath Tagore. Now let's discuss about an overview of this poem, Measurements. The poem Measurements presents a situation which may be assessed in medical terms. It presents situational imagery and tries to involve readers with its action. The poet has stressed the idea of postponement of so many actions in our life in several ways. The poem puts a kind of great inquiry before us, why we always try to put things aside and why we do not show our interest in the situations and the actions of the present. Nabaganda Barua talks about city life in which man has to go through an endless process of measurements which results into nothingness. The poem seems to begin with talking about stitching of clothing in a materialistic sense, but in its deeper meanings it gives philosophical and spiritual perspectives. Different kinds of metaphors have been used to clarify the situations of nothingness and barrenness. Now let's read the lines to get a better understanding of its message. It is afternoon now. Let's go to the tailor's to get measured. Measurements of neck, chest, hands and arms. Measurements of the palm and the heart. We shall give measurements of the entrails and the kidney and the liver. Give measurements of hormones and affections. The poem seems to begin with the stitching of clothing by a tailor in a shop. The narrator of the poem proposes to visit the tailor's shop to give measurements so that the tailor could stitch cloth that fits him. The identity of the narrator is not disclosed, and the poet uses the first person plural pronoun we to address the narrator. The poem begins with the measurement of a person by a tailor, and it turns into a deeper rendering of the inner crisis of the human soul. It takes a philosophical turn as the poem progresses into further stanzas. In these verses, we could see the poet asking us to give measurements of neck, chest, hands and arms, palm, heart, kidney, liver, etc. The poet gives the measurements of the complete human body as if the clothing is being stitched not only to the outer body, which is the anatomical structure, but also inner structures, physiological, of human beings. Next lines. Let us give measurements of life, of this, that and several things. Give only measurements. We shall think of the stitching later on. For the time being, let's just give the measurements. We can only give measurements. In these verses, the poem takes a metaphorical turn. At the same time, it reminds us what it began with. It began with the stitching of cloth, which is now no longer a matter of concern, as there are many other things to be concerned with. It shows that what one begins with never finishes, and another new task is yet to be done, or any other tasks which started earlier also need to be dealt with, and therefore people are caught into an endless series of work, giving measurements alone. Further, the poem shows the helplessness of human beings, that they can only give measurements, because life has become so mechanical that it has made the entire human life a complete failure in almost every sense. It also reminds us of Matthew Arnold's Scholar Gypsy, in which Arnold mentions how human life is divided into 1,000 schemes of wit. So he says in these lines that human beings can only give measurements and he has nothing else to do. In the next few lines, let us read. We can only take reckonings. We shall record that suicides have swelled considerably. We shall give count of the number of letters in a speech, give count of the Christians in Arabia, just give measurements. This section of the poem discusses different kinds of complexities of human life, in which man seems to be very helpless again and again. People commit suicide as they do not find any way out of their problems and miseries. People have to measure, which means they have to take serious considerations of every activity and actions they perform. Even the letters of one's speech ought to be measured, is what the poet emphasizes. Perhaps everything, as mentioned earlier, is just a process or a matter of measurements for the narrator and nothing else. In the next line, the poet says, "We shall think of the stitching later on, merely think." These lines seem to depict the aimlessness and hollowness of human existence, in which man does not have any control over things happening around him. His destiny is predetermined and everything is already set to happen, and man cannot change it. Therefore, He delays or he postpones taking any determined action against the stagnation or the weariness or the problems he faces in his life. So all he does is think alone, and he is postponing things throughout his life. In the next line, the poet says, someone after us will measure anew, saying that our measurements have gone awry. Fresh new measurements they'll take, just take measurements. When will someone stitch the garment to fit man? In these lines, the poem shows that all efforts made by us are futile, and facts are bound to change their meanings and context after a certain period of time. The verses also expresses the relativity of truth and suggests that truth is not timeless. All human efforts are caught in an endless process and never reach their completion. Truth and fact also lose their meaning and relevance in modern times. The poet moves beyond telling that the poem moves beyond the limits of modernity of European traditions in the 20th century and links all human activities to deconstructive semiotic conditions in which the signified is deferred into an endless series of signifiers. The poem shows that all measurements of life are just an endless process, and there is no real measurement as such, and there is not any final cloth that is better stitched to fit us. Everything is just a process without an end and without any meaning. Therefore, the poet ends the poem with the rhetorical question, when will someone stitch the garment to fit man? This rhetorical question towards the end of the poem perhaps refers to pessimist attitude to life and questions many issues like helplessness, procrastination, the futility of human efforts, obscurity, mystery and illusion. It perhaps emphasizes on two issues, when and someone. It asks when the time will come when that clothing is going to be stitched which fits man, and who is someone whose identity is still not clear, and it is certainly not the tailor. It perhaps further seems to say that man grows and man changes. His perceptions and observations change with the changing of time. Modern life is changing fast, and this change brings boredom, incompleteness and frustration that leads to complete failure. Man is helpless and impatient, and he does not fit in all the circumstances and stages of life. Therefore, all the measurements are temporary. To conclude, measurements invites us to reflect on the limitations of quantifying life's most profound experiences and emotions. Through its simple and thought-provoking language, the poem reminds us that not everything can be measured by conventional means. Ultimately, it encourages us to appreciate the intangible and immeasurable aspects of life. So all we can do is, we can do nothing but think and move on. Thank you.